Toward the end of the 20th century, the Middle East witnessed one of the longest and most destructive wars in modern history. The Iran-Iraq War, which began in 1980, lasted for 8 brutal years. This conflict didn't just affect the two countries involved. Its political, economic, and humanitarian consequences rippled across the entire region, and indeed, the world. Millions of lives were forever changed by this war, making it one of the most complex and tragic conflicts of the modern era. But why did Iran and Iraq, two neighboring nations, go to war? Why did the conflict drag on for so long? And in the end, after all the bloodshed and destruction, was there truly a winner? To understand these crucial questions, we must first journey back in time and explore the deep-seated tensions that set the stage for this devastating war. The roots of the Iran-Iraq War are complex, intertwining long-standing disputes with sudden, seismic shifts in regional power. For decades, the two nations had argued over their shared border, particularly the Shat al-Arab waterway. This river, formed by the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, is a vital strategic route for oil exports for both countries, and control over it was a constant point of friction. Then, in 1979, a monumental event shook the entire Middle East. The Iranian Revolution toppled the country's long-reigning monarchy and established a new, revolutionary government. This dramatic political transformation sent shockwaves not only within Iran but far beyond its borders, creating a new and unpredictable dynamic in the region. At the same time, neighboring Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, was actively seeking to establish itself as the dominant Arab power in the Middle East. The new government in Iran was viewed as a direct ideological threat. Iraq's leadership feared that the revolutionary fervor in Iran could inspire similar movements within its own borders, potentially destabilizing its rule. Seeing an opportunity in Iran's post-revolution internal turmoil, Iraq made a fateful decision. In September 1980, Iraqi forces crossed the Iranian border, launching a massive, multi-front invasion. The objective was clear: to secure a swift and decisive victory, cripple the new Iranian government, and assert Iraq's regional dominance once and for all. This act of aggression marked the beginning of what would become one of the longest and deadliest conventional wars of the 20th century. At the outset of the conflict, the Iraqi leadership was confident of a quick military victory. They believed that Iran, still reeling from the chaos of its recent revolution and with its military in a state of disarray, would crumble under the pressure of a full-scale invasion. However, this assumption proved to be a grave miscalculation. Instead of collapsing, the Iranian people and their armed forces mounted a surprisingly fierce and resilient defense. The initial Iraqi advance, which had made some early gains, soon stalled in the face of this determined resistance. What was intended to be a short, sharp war quickly bogged down, and the conflict spread across a vast front line stretching for hundreds of kilometers. The early years of the war were characterized by intense, brutal fighting in the border regions. Cities and towns on both sides were subjected to repeated bombardments and heavy artillery fire. One of the most striking features of this period was how little the front lines actually moved. Despite launching massive ground offensives and suffering horrific casualties, neither side was able to gain a decisive advantage or achieve a significant breakthrough. The war became a grueling, bloody stalemate. The initial Iraqi hope for a lightning victory had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a prolonged and seemingly endless conflict. Both Iran and Iraq found themselves trapped in a devastating war with no clear end in sight. By 1982, it had become painfully clear to both sides that a quick, decisive victory was no longer possible. The war was not going to be won through a single, brilliant military maneuver. Instead, the conflict entered a new, even more brutal phase: a war of attrition. The strategy shifted from seeking a swift victory to simply trying to outlast and exhaust the enemy. The goal was to inflict so many casualties and drain so much of the opponent's resources that they would eventually be forced to surrender. This new phase was defined by massive, human-wave ground offensives, relentless artillery duels, and repeated airstrikes on both military and civilian targets. The fighting was relentless, and the scale of the losses was staggering. As the war of attrition dragged on year after year, the economic burden on both nations grew to an unbearable level. Iran and Iraq were both heavily reliant on their oil revenues to fund their economies and, more importantly, their war efforts. Sustaining such a massive, long-term conflict placed enormous pressure on their national finances. They poured billions of dollars into buying weapons, maintaining their armies, and repairing damaged infrastructure. This immense economic strain began to take a heavy toll, not just on the battlefield, but also on the home front. As resources were diverted from civilian needs to fuel the insatiable demands of the war machine. The war of attrition was not just a military struggle, it was an economic battle for survival. By the mid-1980s, the Iran-Iraq War expanded from the battlefields on land into a new and dangerous arena. The waters of the Persian Gulf, in an attempt to cripple each other's economies. Both Iran and Iraq began targeting oil tankers and merchant ships in the Gulf. This phase of the conflict became known as the Tanker War. Attacks on oil shipments, not just those belonging to Iran and Iraq, but also those of neutral countries, created a major international crisis. These attacks threatened the global energy supply, as a significant portion of the world's oil passed through this vital shipping lane. The escalating danger in the Persian Gulf raised serious concerns among global powers. In response, several foreign navies, including the United States, increased their military presence in the region. Their mission was to protect the freedom of navigation and ensure the safe passage of oil tankers through these treacherous waters. The Tanker War internationalized the conflict, drawing the world's attention to the escalating instability in the Middle East and raising the stakes for everyone involved. While the world watched the military and economic dimensions of the war, the greatest and most tragic cost was borne by the civilians caught in the crossfire. The Iran-Iraq War was not just a confrontation between armies. It was a disaster that devastated entire societies. Cities on both sides of the border were relentlessly targeted by long-range missile attacks and aerial bombardments. Homes, schools, and hospitals were reduced to rubble. Life in these urban centers became a terrifying ordeal, with the constant threat of sudden death from the sky. Millions of people were forced to flee their homes, becoming refugees in their own countries. Entire communities were displaced, and vital infrastructure, from power plants to water systems, suffered severe damage, making daily life a constant struggle for survival. By the time the conflict finally ended, the human toll was catastrophic. It is estimated that up to 1 million people lost their lives, and millions more were injured, widowed, or orphaned. The war left deep, invisible scars on the collective psyche of both nations, a legacy of trauma and loss that would endure for generations. By the late 1980s, after nearly 8 years of relentless fighting, the war had reached a complete and utter stalemate. Both Iran and Iraq had endured unimaginable casualties, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost on the battlefields. Their economies were in ruins, their national resources almost completely exhausted by the astronomical costs of the war. Despite the immense sacrifices and the years of brutal conflict, neither side had managed to achieve its objectives or secure a decisive victory. The front lines had barely moved from where they were years earlier. This grim reality, combined with the growing international alarm over the instability in the Persian Gulf, led to increased diplomatic pressure for a peaceful resolution. The international community, led by the United Nations, intensified its efforts to mediate an end to the seemingly endless bloodshed. The war had bled both nations dry, and it was becoming increasingly clear that continuing the fight was a path to mutual destruction. Finally, in August 1988, after years of failed negotiations and continued fighting, a breakthrough was achieved. Exhausted and facing internal pressures, both Iran and Iraq agreed to accept a ceasefire mediated by the United Nations. After 8 long, devastating years, the guns fell silent. The war officially came to an end. However, the resolution was a bitter one. When the dust settled, the borders between the two countries remained largely unchanged, essentially returning to the status quo that existed before the invasion in 1980. In other words, after 8 years of horrific conflict, immense human suffering, and economic ruin, nothing of substance had been gained. No territory had been definitively won, and no strategic objectives had been achieved. The war ended not with a victory parade, but with a weary, painful recognition of its futility. The Iran-Iraq War stands as one of the longest and most destructive regional conflicts of the modern era. It fundamentally reshaped the political landscape of the Middle East and left deep, lasting scars on both Iran and Iraq that are still visible today. The conflict serves as a powerful and tragic case study in how prolonged wars can drain national resources, devastate societies, and leave behind consequences that linger for decades. After 8 years of brutal fighting, there was no clear winner. There was no victory to celebrate. Instead, the war left behind a powerful and sobering historical lesson about the true cost of conflict. It taught us that sometimes, in war, there is no victory. There is only loss, destruction, and the heavy price that everyone is forced to pay in the end. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please consider liking and subscribing for more explorations of our shared history.